Well, recent developments in the war in Ukraine have left European countries wondering if they have any influence on U.S. President Trump. Last Friday, Washington released a new national security strategy criticizing Europe. U.S. President Trump said this week that some European leaders are stupid. And there's also those Russian funds frozen in Belgium. On Friday, the EU indefinitely froze the money to ensure that Russia-friendly governments in Hungary and Slovakia do not prevent the money from being used to help Ukraine. Russia's central bank is suing the Belgium-based Euroclear, the bank that holds most of those assets, claiming freezing them is illegal. And on Friday, Belgium's prime minister visited Downing Street in London, where he was lobbied to end Belgium's resistance to using the assets for Ukraine's benefit. Brussels fears that it will be left to repay the money to Russia when the war in Ukraine ends. Well, all of this speaks to what is now an undeniable imbalance in power between the Trump administration and Europe. I want to pull in Dave Keating now. He's a Brussels-based journalist, author of the Gulf Stream Blues column on Substack. He's been covering European politics for 20 years, and he is now the author of the new book, The Owned Continent, which poses the question, why have Europeans surrendered to Donald Trump? Dave, it's good to have you on the program. So what exactly is Europe owned by and how?
Yeah, the book is taking a look at all of the acts of surrender that European leaders have made to Donald Trump over the past year, whether it be the various trade deals that the UK and EU and Switzerland signed with the US over the past months, the NATO 5% spending targets, which is a kind of number out of thin air that the US doesn't even meet, but also the kind of supplicant posturing by European leaders as they came to the White House one after another, hat in hand, offering tributary gifts. My book asks the question, why? Why was this the default response from Europe to Trump's aggression and extortion, and not the default response of other places like Brazil, India, and China, for instance, who did not surrender? And the book posits that it's not just geopolitics, it's also psychology. It's the American culture that has dominated this continent for so long that it's made this idea that America could be a threat almost impossible for Europeans to conceive. And that is why I posit that European citizens aren't up in arms about all of this surrender that's happened this year.
Well, perhaps being owned could be a synonym for many people for enjoying being under the U.S. security umbrella, which has been the case for 80 years. I mean, is this change in perception that you're writing about, is it all the result of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, this is a different United States, right? It's even different than Trump's first term when he was really surrounded by the so-called adults in the room. The guardrails were still on then. In this second term, it's really something different entirely. And I think Europeans can no longer think that Trump is just a blip. This is kind of the new United States. Now, when it comes to the military dependence, I think most people are at least vaguely aware of that, although I think most Europeans are not aware of the extent to which Europe is militarily dependent on the United States. But when it comes to economic dominance and cultural dominance, this is something that's really more hidden. It's not something that Europeans think about so much, but if they think about how much of their daily life is spent watching American TV shows, American movies, listening to American music, going on American social media platforms, following American news, you really see that America dominates Europeans' daily lives in a way that it's impossible that it wouldn't have affected people's psychology after all these years.
I want to talk a little bit more about economics and culture in just a moment, but let me ask you about NATO for a second. Is Europe protected by this alliance, or is it politically constrained by NATO? And I'm wondering, where is the line between the two?
Yeah, I mean, NATO has served Europe well in decades past, that's for sure. The question is this: after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, what did NATO become? We all know when French President Emmanuel Macron called NATO brain dead back in 2017, there was huge backlash, particularly from the Atlanticist thinkers on this continent. But really, he was right. I mean, NATO was in a bad place, and it's still in a bad place, even if it convinces itself that it's more necessary than ever because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the fact is NATO is under under an American command and control structure that doesn't work without the United States. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, has said so herself. There is no NATO without the United States. That's not really an alliance. That's a protectorate. So the attempts that have taken place, and I walk through this in my book, the attempts that took place over the past decades trying to establish a European pillar of NATO so that you could have two equal partners, kept being defeated by the United States and its partners in London, in Warsaw, in Berlin, who were opposing these efforts at EU defense. And that's left NATO still as something that doesn't work without the United States, which makes it very, very scary when the US president says he may not honor the Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause, or he could pull the US out of NATO altogether.
Dave, I'm wondering, the war in Ukraine, is it pushing Europe towards a more independence? I'm thinking about next week's end-of-year European Union summit, for example. Leaders are expected to decide how to keep financing Ukraine to the tune of, 200 billion euros. So the question is, will Europe finally, make accessible those frozen Russian assets to Ukraine? I mean, this is looking like a make-or-break moment to show that Europe is serious about standing on its own 2 feet. How do you see it?
Yeah, that will be the key question for that summit next week, because it is the last chance. Ukraine will run out of money in April, and the next European Council summit isn't until March. So if they don't agree this next week, Ukraine's not getting that money. Ukraine desperately needs that money because the US has stopped supporting Ukraine except for intelligence cooperation. Already, Europeans have agreed to be the middlemen in transferring American arms to Ukraine under this new system. The US is no longer sending arms to Ukraine. European countries are buying the American arms and sending them to Ukraine. So already you have a situation where the US has pulled a lot of support. If the Europeans can't get this money to Ukraine, Ukraine probably has to surrender. That is the analysis of defense experts. So it's really critical next week. But on the point of whether the Ukraine crisis is making Europe get its act together and be more independent, ironically, it's the exact opposite. Because Europe is so scared of Russia now and is in such an emergency situation with Ukraine, they've been terrified to offend the Trump administration. We've had the so-called daddy diplomacy that was nicknamed by think tanks here in Brussels after Mark Rutte calling Trump daddy at that NATO summit in June. So you've actually had the opposite effect, that Europe has been too scared to try to pursue independent defense at this critical moment because Russia is there looming as a threat. And without the United States, Europe is somewhat defenseless.
Let me ask you then a little bit about economics here and the tech sector. Is Europe, in your opinion, is it doomed to be the rules maker and the regulator while the U.S. remains the innovator?
Yeah, this is something I touch on the book. Europe kind of missed the internet revolution 25 years ago. And so all of the biggest tech companies are all American, and they are running our daily lives. They're running our operating systems, our phones, our social media, how we stream movies and television. And that situation's for a lot of factors, none of which, by the way, are to do with EU regulation, which a lot of people like to say. It's from an absence of seed capital, many reasons which I go through in the book. But the end result is that right now, Europeans are dependent on these American tech giants. And if these companies decided to pull their services suddenly from Europe, it would leave our governments unable to function, our businesses unable to function. We wouldn't even be able to pay each other or buy things at the grocery store. So Europe is so incredibly dependent on these American companies. This isn't something you can solve overnight, but a lot of questions I think are now being asked. How did Europeans get themselves to this place?
In this notion of cultural dominance over Europe, what does that look like in European politics, and why should voters even care?
Well, the problem is that Europeans tend to know way more about American politics than they know about European politics, certainly more than they know about EU politics, and oftentimes more than they know about their own national politics, because our media here in Europe is so dominated by news from the United States. And that creates a real problem if Europeans aren't paying attention to the critical decisions that have to be made at EU and national level. If they're so focused on the United States, on US elections, on the back and forth between the Democratic Party, who's going to be the nominee, that's not their country. That's a different country. But the problem is this cultural domination in Europe has led many Europeans to almost feel like they live in the United States, or at least on the outer edges of an American empire. And that keeps them from being politically engaged in their own processes here on this continent.
Yeah, it's fascinating, fascinating. When we look at demographics here in Europe, an aging continent, its generous and expensive social welfare programs, and now the push to spend billions on defense, especially here in Germany. I mean, if we just do the math, the future of Europe will have to look dramatically different if it wants to wean itself off of the U.S. and be able to defend itself. So is the message to Europe, make up your mind, you can't have it all?
Somewhat, yes. There is a necessity to spend a lot more on defense, and that is going to mean making some tough budgetary choices in the coming years. However, if Europe were to pool its military activity, and this is another thing I touch on the book, it actually doesn't require a huge amount of money. The amount of money that's being demanded to be spent by the United States is not necessary if the EU can stop duplication, can create an EU defense union, and eliminate that duplication. There's been studies out saying that actually the amount of money that would be spent if you combined that with establishing a sovereign European military defense that was capable of independent action, it is a completely manageable cost. If you are asking for Europeans to individually, as individual armies and individual countries, throw money at buying American weapons while maintaining this American security umbrella, then yes, that is going to cost billions of euros, and it would mean a huge degradation in people's quality of life and their social welfare. But it's not necessary if Europe were to actually develop this combined European defense.
Dave Keating, author of the new book, The Own Continent. It sounds like a good Christmas present, if you ask me. Dave, good to have you on the show. We appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Good to be here.